Hello Tennos, this is Zelp and it's been a while. Today's video is going to be about buffs and debuffs, Warframe abilities that can increase other Warframe damage abilities. To learn more about it, the first thing I did was to put Warframe with buff abilities side by side. Since we are trying to enhance other Warframe damage abilities, we won't be testing buffs that is for weapons only, like the one with Mirage or Chroma. The idea here is to bring two Warframes, one as a control damage dealer, which in this case will be my mag's first ability Pool that deals 300 damage. The other frame will be a buff or debuff Warframe. We use the charger as the test subject simply because we can see the raw damage without the influence of shields, armor, and also health type modifiers. After testing the damage with and without buffs on both Warframes with no mods on, we then record the damage when one of them has the Intensify on, which gives 30% increase in power strength, and after that we do it with the other buff Warframe using Intensify instead, and finally we record the damage of both of them equipped with Intensify and see how it actually stacks up and if it stacks up well. With the data collected, we can work out some logical explanations to how the damage actually come to be. A lot of it is explained in wiki, but a clearer comparison could be seen with a controlled damage and a table I am about to present to you. After all that, we basically repeat the whole thing for Warframes with debuffing abilities. The Warframe tested was Nidus, Equinox, and Rhino for buff abilities. As for debuff, we went with Gara, Nova, Mag, and Banshee. Without any more delays, here is what I found. So over here is the table that I've tabulated in order to show the results and damage values. We have player A as the control caster, which is the mag, using the first ability that deals 300 damage, and if any one of them were to use Intensify, it gives you 30% power strength. Player B is the buffer and player C is the debuffer. As you can see that this part of the table is all about the values between player A and player B, which is the buffer and the caster, and over here everything is between the debuffer and the caster, which is player A and player C. The third and fourth columns are when both of them does not use any mods at all. So they do not have Intensify, things like that. As you can see, when Mag uses the first ability, it does 300 damage, and when Nidus buff Mag with the third ability, it will go up to 386. This part right below Nidus's is the calculations and what I believe to be how the value come to be, so you can take a look at that if you want to. If not, you can just ignore it and just look at the value above or at the next to the names of the Warframes. The fifth and sixth columns are when only the caster were to use a Intensify, but the buffer does not, the buffer or debuffer in this case. And then over here is that when only the buffer or debuffer has Intensify, however Mag, which is the control damage, does not. And finally we have when both of them uses an Intensify and the value is taken from here. You may have realized that the calculation part is somehow color coded. The reason is being that I want to show you like certain limitations and also weaknesses that some of the buffs or debuffs have. The green ones are the most common ones, and they basically work by multiplying between each other. So for example, if a mag were to have an Intensify on, the mag's power strength will be increased by 30%, and basically you times that in and you get 130%. Then your mag is going to do 390 damage. If you were to use, let's say, Rhino for his roar, which gives you 50% bonus damage or bonus power strength buff, it will actually take that 130 power strength of mag and increase that by 50%, which gives you 195 power strength now. and mag is going to do 585. Now this is a little bit fuzzy because it can also mean that it just increases the overall damage of the first one, which is 390 damage, into just by increasing it by 50%, and that works too because they are all multiplying. It doesn't matter where it starts multiplying or when it multiplies between each other. As long as they do, at the end the results is still the same, and this is how most of the buff works. However, there is something a little bit fishy when it comes to Equinox when mag is using intensify and the buffer is not. It seems that Equinox buff, the 20% that it gives in its third ability, increases mag's intensify by giving mag a fixed, or should I say a flat buff value. So for example, the example that I given just now is that mag has 30% power strength, so it does this amount of damage. If you were to use Equinox, it gives 20% increase in power strength. It will actually take that 130 power strength and increase it by 20. So you will get 150 power strength now. So it's a lot weirder and a lot different than most buffs. And what this means is that at later point at the game, when you have more than just 30% power strength, when you have more, you'll see a lacking in damage from Equinox's buff because of this. However, when it comes to them having intensified the buffers, or the buffers that has it, it does stack up normally, so it does increase that 20% by extra 30%. That's what I meant over here. So you see it's green, and then this one I show it in a slightly orangey just to remind you that there is a problem with the second part of the way it stacks. And yeah, so that is basically it. For Nidus is also a little bit tricky because you may have realized that there is this part of the calculation, because Nidus has a passive that gives it, let me see, I've written down over here, there you go. He has a passive. When you reach max rank, you get an extra 15 power strength. That means it doesn't start off with 100 power strength, but instead it starts with 115 power strength. So you have to add that in, and that 15% is going to be as if it's in a mod type power strength. So the way it stacks is as if it's a mod. So over here you can see that when you add intensify, it actually adds with the intensify and not multiplied with the intensify. However, over here, since you do not have anything on, that 15% will be multiplied into the ability because it's taken as if it's intensify. Now we're going to take a look at the table below on the debuffers, and we're going to start with Gara. Now debuffs and buffs are actually very similar. Instead of saying that you increase your damage by 50%, you can also say that you increase the damage the enemy is taking by 50%. It's exactly the same thing. You'll realize that Rhino and Gara actually does the exact same amount of damage for mag after the buff or debuff, because they are both 50% increased. And you'll realize that the way it stacks or calculated is also exactly the same, because they are all multiplied. It doesn't matter how you multiply it and where you put it. However, when it comes to Nova's increase by 100% damage, or basically 2 times damage, is fixed. It doesn't increase as Nova's power strength increases. However, if the caster's power strength were to increase, it still increase in damage, but then you realize that it's either, you know, twice of this value, twice of 300, which gives you 600, or twice of 390, that gives you 780. Even when both of them have intensify on, you're still going to do that amount of damage. That means it cannot go more than 2 times the damage. Next we have Mag. Her abilities, or rather her debuff, which is magnetize, her second ability, doesn't only just give you an extra 100% damage. In fact, it actually double dips when it comes to ability damage, and it gives you 4 times that damage. So by right, it should give you twice as much damage, but now it gives you 4 times. It's like it double dips. There is an extra 1+1 over here, which adds up to an extra 2 times damage. Now I cannot really explain this or why it's happening like that. I can only notify you that it is happening. So instead of doing 600 damage, which is 100%, it's doing 1200 damage. Now this part is the only part that actually adds to this amount. The rest of it actually stacks up normally, but then because of this part, it also stacks up with this thing. So that means if you were to increase max, let's say power strength by 30%, so now it does 390 damage, it will still do 4 times the amount of damage of this value. But then what I'm trying to say is that the way it's being multiplied in it is still the same. It's actually exactly 30% extra damage from here to here. If the buffer, which is so happens also mag, were to do this as well, increases intensify, put in intensify, increases power strength by 30%, it also increases by 30%, so that's why you get a similar value over here. And then and at the end, when both of them have it, it basically takes this value and increase by 30% and then increase by another 30% after that value. So everything else adds up the way that it should, is only that this part has a double dip property, and it's because of that this value becomes really huge. For mag, you cannot actually do this test alone. We need 2 mags to actually pull this off, because you don't want to have mag as the caster to have intensify in this section, and you don't want mag as a buffer to have intensify this section. Okay, now if you look at the ratio, this is actually a lot. It's about roughly more than 5 times the damage that you're doing, which just intensify in both parties. So it's really good, but however, the drawback is that max ability is very limited. It only works on the selected enemy. So that is the limitation for mag. Next we have Banshee, and Banshee is actually probably the best debuffer in terms of damage, but in terms of usefulness, it may differ because it gives spots. The second ability makes spots on the enemy, and you must hit that spot in order for it to work. Now it's not possible to how do I say, aim with max pull, but if you manage to use Banshee and somehow the randomized spot were to be at the center where max pull damage happen, it will increase that damage by 5 times. Yes, so Banshee's buff actually increases the damage by an extra 400%. So you'll see that instead of like 2 times like Nova, it will actually increase up to 1500 damage without mods. And when you have mods, everything stacks up the way it should be, and you get this amount, which is about 7 times from the original damage. So Banshee does give you the best damage output, but it's really hard to use. You could pair it up with a different kind of Warframe that has slightly different abilities, like for example Ember with her first ability, or Frost or Volt. Those abilities can actually be aimed, and it will be a lot easier to do a very huge and significant damage if you want to. Next, we're going to take a look at the further part of the table over here, this section. But let me first just simplify this so that you have a better view. Let me hide this. Now this part is when both of them are highly modded, and by this I mean they achieve 284% power strength by increasing it with Intensify, Transcend Fortitude, and Blind Rage maxed out. The problem here is that these values are not actual, they are calculated values according to the calculations that I come up with, the equations. Because I don't have a maxed out Blind Rage, I cannot actually prove these values, but then it should be around this value, and we're gonna see how does those value actually plays out, and we also calculate the ratio in the damage increase when both of them are somewhat heavily modded. Now I know this is not the maximum power strength that it can go, but it's one of the easiest one to achieve. So let's say Nidus, when Mag has all those mods on, she'll be doing 852 damage. When Nidus buff with, again, all those mods on, it will increase the damage to 1488. This is an increment of 74% damage, or 75. If you were to use Equinox, because of what happened in the front part of Equinox's calculations, that hinders it and makes it sort of limited, such that even when they are both heavily modded, the increase in damage is only 20%. The next one is Rhino, which is decent. If both are heavily modded, the damage can go up to 1.4 times the damage, as in not times the damage, but extra 142% damage. That's what it means here. So if you want to use it in terms of times, you're gonna have to add a 1 here. So this is actually 1.74 times. This will be 2.42 times. So it increases by 142 damage. Next, we're gonna take a look at Gara, and Gara is exactly the same as Rhino. So we have a ratio here. Then we have Nova. Now again, Nova does not vary because power strength does not actually increase the damage multiplier of its ability. So it's still going to be exactly 100% extra, or 2 times damage. When it comes to Mag, now this one is really interesting because it goes all the way to about 11 times the damage. So it increases about 1036% damage. And then we have Banshee, which also increases very significantly because of its base value that gives you 14 times the damage. And this is really good. Also for Banshee, the dots can be stacked. So for example, if you cast it multiple times and 2 dots were to align, it will actually stack up, like it will times 2. So this value, if there is two stacks on it, it will come out as 24k damage instead of just 12k damage. So while doing some double checking of the calculations with Wiki, I also realized that Equinox's buff cannot exceed 50%. And this just makes it even worse than it already is. Because if you come back over here, this means that the power limit that the Equinox can reach to that actually improves the buff is only 250%. Any more than 250% power strength is not going to actually benefit Equinox. And right now we have 284. This means that one of it, the one that actually affects Equinox, which is this one, is capped at 1.5 because this 2 adds up to 250%. So this means that the value is only this much, and the ratio is only 17.6% increased with Equinox, and that is just really sad. The next one, which you guys might be wondering, is how do they stack? Now if it's a buff, the good thing about buffs is that the buff might be able to buff the buffer and cause the buffer to buff even higher. Not sure if you get all that, but that's a discussion for some other time. So right now let's end this with a quick summary. As a buffer, Rhino is probably the best one, followed by Nidus, and lastly Equinox. Equinox is pretty bad in this case. As for debuffers, the best one's going to be Banshee. However, there is that limitation of you having to aim at the specific spot. Mag is going to be the next best thing. However, Mag is also limited in such that it only applies to the selected enemy. And then for Nova, is good if you do not have a lot of power strength on the debuffer. However, if you have like maxed out power strength or relatively high power strength, its damage gonna fall off from Gara. So Gara is actually gonna be the next best thing if you have good mods. And that is pretty much it. Now I know at this point you probably have a lot of questions like how do they interact between the buffs and debuffs, and among the buffs and among the debuffs. and also probably like questions like what's the best way of stacking them to give you the best damage output. But sadly, all those things will have to come some other time. Although we did some tests, we also need to do more tests in order to figure out the best or the sweet spot of stacking them. And also, of course, since we did a buff that affects Warframe abilities, we are also looking into buffs that affects weapons. So all those things will be for the future. I hope at this point whatever that is conveyed to you does help you understand some abilities, or at least if you want to be a buffer or debuffer, which is probably the best one for the conditions that you are going to be facing. Now it is time for the Glyph Giveaways. All those that submitted or entered the Glyph Giveaway on YouTube correctly, which is to type in Glyphaway on my last video, the Juggernaut one, you will have the glyph, because we have passed a number of milestones for 25 Glyph Giveaways, and every single one of you gets one, because we have about 20 submissions that did it correctly, and it was on my last video. So congratulations all of you. Make sure you check your name down in the description, and if you see it there, just PM me on Discord and I will give you the glyph. As for the video itself, it is inspired by a suggestion from Tone503. So congratulations as well. All you have to do is just send me a Discord message and I will give you your reward. Okay, and that's all for this video. Please like and subscribe, or even bell me if you want to see more detailed testing and ideas in Warframe. I do like to apologize for the delay in uploads. It's a new year, new work schedule. Every day feels both mentally and physically exhausting for me. I even had to cancel one of the stream schedules, and I was also working on some improvement for these channels, so do expect minor changes. Also, the new damage system is around the corner, and I am sort of avoiding making videos involving damage system due to the fear of it changing the next day. I'll see you guys in the next video, Tennos. Have a pleasant day. Bye bye. Hey.